I'm sad in retrospect, hindsight's 2020. I'm sad that I wasn't more hard on Ace and Peter, the two original guys who played guitar and drums in the.
The church was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's carrying decades of memories and regret. A single guitar riff echoed faintly through the speakers. The opening notes of "Shock Me." Every soul in the room knew exactly whose sound that was. It was Ace Frehley, the spaceman of Kiss, the man who turned noise into art, rebellion into rhythm. For years, his guitar didn't just play, it spoke. And now, for the first time, that voice was gone. As fans gathered from across the world, old bandmates took their seats in the front row. Faces, once hidden behind makeup, now showed the truth of time, lined, weary, but filled with emotion. Yet one figure drew every eye when he walked through those doors: Gene Simmons. For decades, Gene and Ace shared one of rock's most complicated relationships. Friends, rivals, brothers, enemies. Their story was loud, chaotic, and unforgettable. But what Gene did that day silenced the entire world. When he stepped up to the podium, even the photographers stopped clicking. The man known for his confidence and bravado suddenly spoke with trembling sincerity. His tribute wasn't about fame, money, or the Kiss empire. It was about friendship, forgiveness, and the kind of bond that only music could create. That moment, Gene Simmons' powerful, unexpected farewell, changed how the world saw both men forever. Before the chaos, before the fame, before the stadiums shook with fire and sound, there was just Paul Ace Frehley, a shy kid from the Bronx with a beat-up guitar and a dream that seemed too wild for reality. Born into a working-class family in 1951, Ace was far from the polished rock god he'd later become. He was quiet, awkward, and often lost in his own world. But when he picked up a guitar, something changed. Something awoke. Music wasn't just his escape. It was his salvation. In a city filled with noise, Ace learned to create his own. Influenced by Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, and Led Zeppelin, he taught himself how to make his guitar talk. Friends would later say he didn't just play notes, he played emotions. In the early 70s, New York's rock scene was electric. The city pulsed with underground energy, from smoky bars to small clubs where new sounds were being born. It was in that world that fate brought Ace together with three other young dreamers: Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss. Together, they formed what would become one of the most iconic and theatrical rock bands in history, Kiss. Each member became a larger-than-life persona: the Demon, the Star Child, the Catman, and the Spaceman, Ace's alter ego. His futuristic look, silver suit, and blazing solos became the stuff of legend. When he stepped on stage, sparks flew, literally. His smoking guitar became one of the most unforgettable images in rock history. But behind the makeup and fire, there was something real: a bond. Especially between Ace and Gene. While Gene was ambitious, disciplined, and business-minded, Ace was the heart: wild, creative, unpredictable. They clashed often, but there was mutual respect. Gene admired Ace's raw talent. Ace admired Gene's drive. Together they built a sound that changed rock forever. The mid-70s saw Kiss explode into superstardom. Albums like Destroyer and Love Gun turned them into gods of the stage. Kids wore their makeup, sold out arenas, screamed their names, and the Kiss logo became a symbol of rebellion. But fame came with a price. Behind the lights, tensions brewed. Ace struggled with the fame, the pressure, and the endless touring. His love for the music began to clash with the excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle. Alcohol became a companion, and creative disagreements started to fracture the band's unity. Gene, always focused on the bigger picture, tried to hold things together, but Ace was slipping further away. Still, through all the chaos, Gene never stopped calling him "my brother." Even when words turned into arguments, and arguments turned into distance, there was always a strange kind of love there, buried deep beneath the noise. By the early 80s, Ace finally walked away. The spaceman had left the mothership. The decision broke hearts, not just among fans, but inside the band itself. But what no one could have predicted was that their story wasn't over, because in rock and roll, as in life, the loudest goodbyes often come before the most powerful returns. When Ace Frehley left Kiss in the early 80s, it wasn't just the end of an era. It was the unraveling of a man who had once felt invincible. The face paint came off, the stage lights dimmed, and for the first time in years, Ace was alone. The noise that had once fueled him now echoed in silence. At first, he tried to convince himself he was fine. He released solo albums, played small shows, and promised fans he was free. But freedom can be a lonely thing when you've tasted immortality. Away from the energy of Kiss, the fire, the thunder, the brotherhood, Ace began to spiral. The rock and roll lifestyle that once seemed like a reward became a curse. Alcohol and substances dulled the pain, but also dimmed the spark that made him great. His friends tried to reach him, but Ace built walls higher than his amplifiers. Reporters wrote stories about his erratic behavior, canceled tours, and near-death experiences. The spaceman who once soared across arenas now seemed lost in his own orbit. Gene Simmons, meanwhile, watched from afar. For all their differences, he never stopped caring. In interviews, Gene often spoke with tough love about Ace's struggles. "I love the guy," he once said. "But you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped." Still, every time Ace stumbled, Gene reached out. Sometimes privately, sometimes publicly. Their bond, though fractured, refused to die completely. In the mid-90s, the impossible happened. Kiss reunited. When Ace stepped back onto the stage with Gene, Paul, and Peter, it was as if time had folded in on itself. The world went wild. Stadiums filled again, the makeup returned, and so did the fire. For a moment, it felt like the dream had been restored, but behind the curtain, the same old demons lurked. The old conflicts resurfaced: creative control, money, ego, exhaustion. Ace tried to stay grounded, but fame has a way of pulling people back into the storm. The reunion was beautiful, but it was fragile, a spark in a thunderstorm. Eventually, the cycle repeated. Ace walked away again, this time older, tired, but not broken. "I needed peace," he would later say, "and I needed to remember why I started playing in the first place." In the years that followed, he rebuilt himself piece by piece. He released new music, reconnected with fans, and tried to stay sober. But time had taken its toll. The years of excess had carved lines into his face and shadows into his voice. Yet even in his frailty, there was something pure. The same spark that first made him pick up a guitar in a Bronx apartment so many years ago. Gene and Ace remained, distant but connected. Two men, bound by a shared history that neither could escape. Gene once said in an interview, "You spend decades on stage with someone, and they become a part of your DNA." And so, when the news came years later that Ace Frehley was gone, it hit Gene harder than anyone could have imagined. He didn't issue a press release. He didn't tweet. He just went silent. For a man who built a career on volume, that silence spoke volumes. In the quiet twilight of his life, Ace Frehley had become something rare, a rock star at peace with his own reflection. Gone were the wild nights of endless parties and flashing lights. Instead, his days were filled with music, memories, and a kind of solitude that comes only after a lifetime of noise. Friends who visited him in those final years described a man who had found a gentle rhythm. He'd wake early, make coffee, and sit with his guitar by the window of his upstate New York home. Sometimes he'd strum old Kiss riffs, sometimes soft blues, and sometimes nothing at all, just letting the silence speak. "It's funny," he told a close friend once. "The older I get, the more I hear the music that isn't even being played." Ace's health had begun to fade quietly. Years of living on the edge had taken their toll. There were hospital visits, medication changes, and moments of weakness that he tried to hide. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to be remembered for the joy, the laughter, the rebellion, not the pain. But those closest to him knew. They could see the way his hands shook slightly when he picked up his guitar, the way his breath shortened after just a few notes. Even then, his spirit refused to surrender. "I've cheated death before," he joked. "Maybe I'll do it again." As news of his declining health leaked to the press, tributes began to pour in. Fans around the world flooded social media with memories, old concert photos, bootleg recordings, shaky footage from the 70s. For many, Ace wasn't just a guitarist. He was a symbol of freedom. The spaceman wasn't perfect, but that was exactly why people loved him. He was real. Gene Simmons learned of Ace's condition through a mutual friend. The message was simple. "You should call him." Gene hesitated. Decades of love, anger, and unspoken words hung between them. But something inside him, maybe guilt, maybe affection, pushed him to pick up the phone. When Ace answered, his voice was weak but playful. "Gene, is that you? Or just my phone trying to sell me another Kiss lunchbox?" For a moment, both men laughed. The ice melted. What followed was not an argument or a business talk. It was two old friends remembering who they once were. They spoke about the early days, about the music, the madness, and the magic that had changed their lives forever. When Gene hung up, he didn't realize it would be the last time he'd ever hear Ace's voice. Just weeks later, the news broke. Ace Frehley had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The rock world froze. Social media exploded with disbelief, then grief. Rock stations across America played Shock Me and New York Groove on repeat. Candlelight vigils appeared outside concert halls and record stores, but no reaction was more anticipated than Gene Simmons's. For hours, there was silence. Fans waited, knowing that whatever Gene said would matter. Then, late that night, a single message appeared on his official page. "The spaceman has returned to the stars. My brother, my bandmate, my friend, thank you for the ride." It was short, heartfelt, and raw, a side of Gene few had ever seen. Behind the scenes, Gene began planning something deeply personal. A private tribute unlike anything the rock world had witnessed before. Because to Gene, Ace wasn't just another musician. He was part of his own story, a reflection of the youth they'd both lost, the dream they'd built, and the chaos they'd somehow survived. In that moment, Gene made a vow. The world would say goodbye to Ace Frehley not with silence, but with the thunder he deserved. The morning of Ace Frehley's funeral was quiet, almost eerily so. A soft drizzle fell over the small church in New York where the private ceremony was to be held. Outside, hundreds of fans gathered in the rain, holding guitars, candles, and worn-out Kiss records against their chests. They didn't need an invitation. They were there to say goodbye to the man who made them believe that rock and roll could be cosmic. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with emotion. The pews were lined with family, old bandmates, and friends from every era of Ace's life. Musicians who had once shared the stage, and others who had once shared his chaos. There were tears, yes, but also laughter, because every story about Ace seemed to end in some ridiculous, loud, unforgettable memory. Then Gene Simmons walked in. Dressed entirely in black, his usual armor of confidence seemed to fade. For once, he wasn't Gene Simmons, the demon from Kiss. He was just Gene, a man who had lost his brother. The room grew silent as he approached the casket, his eyes fixed on the photo of a young Ace smiling, guitar in hand, forever frozen in the prime of his wild youth. He took a long breath, placed his hand on the coffin, and whispered something no one could hear. Some said later it was a prayer. Others said it was an apology. When it was time to speak, Gene stepped up to the podium, his deep voice trembling slightly as he began. "I met Ace Frehley in 1972, he said softly. He walked into our audition, wearing 2 different sneakers and carrying a guitar that looked like it had been through a war. We thought he was crazy. Turns out we were right. But that's exactly why we loved him." A wave of soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Gene smiled, the kind of smile that hides years of history. Ace wasn't just the spaceman. He was the pulse behind the madness, the one who reminded us that rock wasn't about perfection. It was about energy, rebellion, and fun. He made mistakes. We all did. But he played every note like it was his last. And now, it really was. Gene paused, his eyes glassy. The man who once breathed fire on stage now struggled just to find words. We fought, we drifted apart, we said things we shouldn't have. But even when we were miles away, I always felt him up there, somewhere in the stars. And now he's finally home. He stepped back from the podium, and for a moment it felt like time itself stood still. Then, unexpectedly, Gene walked over to the stage set up at the front of the church. A small amp, a single microphone, and Ace's old Les Paul guitar resting on a stand. Without saying a word, Gene picked up the guitar. His fingers trembled as he strummed a few soft notes, the opening riff to Shock Me. The crowd gasped. It was raw, imperfect, and beautiful. Slowly, other musicians joined in. Paul Stanley, Peter Criss, even a few from Ace's solo band. Together, they filled the church with music one last time. It wasn't a performance, it was a farewell. When the final chord rang out, Gene lifted the guitar high, his eyes wet, and whispered, "Rest easy, spaceman. You lit up the world." Outside, the fans cheered through their tears, chanting Ace's name as the casket was carried out under the gray sky. In that moment, the legend of Ace Frehley transcended death itself, not as a fallen rock star, but as a symbol of what it means to truly live. Later that night, Gene posted one final message online. It was a photo of the stars, with just 3 words beneath it. "See you soon, brother." And for millions around the world, those words echoed the truth that music never dies. It simply changes form. Ace Frehley was gone, but his riffs, his laughter, and his light would keep shining forever among the stars.